All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So today I will be talking about some of the challenges of collecting event data in conflict settings. But for doing so, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about what ACLED is and what it does. So ACLED is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. We are a data set that collects data on political violence and demonstrations around the world in near real time. This data is uploaded weekly and available with some use limitations on our website after registering a free account. ACLED is now an independent NGO, but we started out as an academic project, hence the name project. And because of that academic background, we are grounded in a rigorous and robust methodology. We are also a fully remote organization with no physical offices. We always have been, by the way. It was even before COVID. And we have that because we found that it helps us build a diverse team of researchers that is based around the world and has knowledge of local languages and local contexts. In addition to the data that we make available weekly, we also have research and analysis that we publicize. These include regional overviews that we produce weekly to give an overview of developments in the region, as well as more in-depth pieces on actors, trends in conflict, and other infographics. And we also have some special projects and initiatives like our early warning research hub that provide early warning about trends in conflict and political violence. Now, the data that we have available is event-based. We are an event-based data set, which means that we are quite granular as we code incidents by a specific day, specific location, including geocoordinates for mapping and spatial analysis, and types of engagement, which in turn means that this information can be used very flexibly to accommodate various types of analysis, ranging from very local analysis to country or region-wide analyses, using both data from recent as well as longer, over longer time periods. We cover a wide range of disorder, not just battles, but also shellings, bombings, protests, violence against civilians, and strategic developments. And we record the involved actors in these events, as well as providing estimates of fatalities involved, which we record conservatively, meaning we quote the lower numbers that are estimated by various sources. And finally, we also provide a description of the event that allows you to contextualize these data and potentially do more in-depth research. Now, the coverage is, as I said, global. We cover all countries and territories across the globe. And we have historical data going back at least 1 year and up to 25 years for some countries, allowing you to do analyses that are spread out over time. Now, of course, to the main body of this is how we get all this information. And what we do with our sourcing approach is that we have a dedicated team of researchers with knowledge of local languages and contexts. They use sourcing lists that are specifically tailored to local contexts to leverage their local knowledge as well. We rely on human collection of data and review of reports. We found that in particular, automated approaches to data collection would cause us to be missing certain events because descriptions aren't always as clear-cut, keywords don't always work, and also there are some technical challenges around consistent scraping, for example, of websites. And of course, we do all this with methodological rigor in our sourcing, and I hope you'll see what that entails as I proceed with this presentation. So, where does information from ACLED come from? As mentioned, we use sourcing lists tailored to local contexts. That means we cover an extremely broad range of sources in over 100 languages. Of course, it would be a lot easier, for example, to just scrape a set of English language news sources and be done with it. But we found that doing that would miss a lot of the local dynamics that happen on the ground, which is why we've taken a different approach at ACLED to try and get closer to what is happening on the ground and capture those local dynamics. So this involves use of traditional media, national newspapers, local radio, all in local languages. And we also use, to some degree, trusted new media sources. We don't like to really crowdsource social media. We like to be in control of what we pull in, and I'll explain that a little bit later as well. But we do use vetted Twitter accounts, for example, of journalists that we found especially useful in some of the spaces where the traditional media environment might be rather closed. We also draw on in-depth reporting that come from international organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, or the United Nations. And because of their efforts in some specific conflict contexts, those reports allow us to include some information that otherwise would not be accessible. But most importantly, we have partnerships with local organizations, over 50 around the world, local activist organizations or conflict observatories. And these partnerships provide us with unique information that usually cannot be found in other sources. The local knowledge and access information that our partners provide are crucial to extending our coverage to some of the most underreported regions and conflicts in the world. Now, we have spent a lot of time at ACLED figuring out the best way to source our data. And the reason why is because when we look at different data projects, especially the global ones that cover political violence, we sometimes see that they have broadly different trends depicted in the data. And of course, that is something that raises questions. Why does one data set say that a country is experiencing an increase in violence, where other data sets say that there is a decrease? And while a number of things can feed into those differences, like the unit of analysis, typology, definitions, we have found that sourcing is the most important factor in explaining those differences. Where these projects get their information from, how they source, drastically impacts what their data looks like. And of course, then the following question is, okay, what is then a good approach? Usually the question is, do I need to find more sources in order to become more reliable? And which of the sources are best? And we have found that perhaps counterintuitively, more sources aren't necessarily better, because all sources contain some biases, specific focuses. And so if you were to merely include more sources, you might be reproducing these biases on a larger scale and still not get accurate data that accurately reflects what's going on the ground. To give an example of that, if you have an international media outlet based in the United States, they might report on certain types of events abroad, like those that are high in casualties, things that their readership are more interested in reading about, or they might report more on incidents that happen in certain areas of the country because foreign correspondents have more access to that. And if you were to include more of those international sources, you would simply be reproducing the biases of including the high impact, high casualty events, or the events that happen around capitals and other populated areas, and kind of reinforcing that bias. And what you would be missing is the information or the events that are in the less accessible rural areas, areas where international media don't come as often, or where the reporting is a lot more difficult. So what we've done is that we have tried to account for these different challenges, and they are different per context and per country. And we've created sourcing lists that try to mitigate all these issues. We include national sources, we include subnational sources, we make sure that there's even distribution geographically on what is being covered, all in order to mitigate these potential biases and have as even coverage, as reliable coverage as possible. And as a result, what we found also that local reporting is the key to doing this. Local reporting leverages the local knowledge of what's going on the ground, but also tends to report not only on the big events, but also on the smaller events of violence against civilians, smaller clashes, things that aren't picked up by the international media. And by sourcing local reporting, especially in the local languages, we unlock and capture those events that would otherwise go uncovered. Now, on the importance of consistency, because consistency is important to get good data that you can use to analyze across time and across regions. And it is meant to reduce bias. Now, like I said before, we use carefully curated sourcing lists that allow us to consistently cover a conflict. We do not source our reports at random or pull in data from massive crawls. But rather, we go through the list and that we keep balanced and adjusted to the local context. So this approach is very structured. We keep meticulous track of what we cover, where we source our reports from on a weekly basis. And we also monitor our collection process to spot, for example, sources going dark or changing their reporting style, what they report on. Or we monitor for other issues that can cause inconsistent sourcing. In addition to that, whenever we add new sources, we, of course, evaluate how this impacts the overall approach of the country. So the sourcing list that we have, whether that introduces biases, as well as making sure that we provide historical coverage of that source, which we call backcoding. If we didn't do that and we would introduce a new source in 2022, you might see a spike of clashes in a certain region that isn't due to an actual development on the ground. It's simply due to having added a new source that extends the coverage to those events. So in order to prevent those temporal biases over time, we first go back and code the historical data that is available through the archives and make sure that there is actually an even coverage throughout time of the source before releasing it to our real-time data, thereby also preventing the artificial data spikes. And then one last point that is really important to emphasize is that static sourcing is not consistent sourcing. We have a lot of developments that we see on the ground that impact what sources can report. Sources can change their behavior, and we found that we really need to adjust our approach as sources and environments change in order to keep our data consistent, because continuing to cover the same sources as they go dark and saying we keep it consistent and therefore we don't replace it by new sources, that would actually obviously introduce a much larger bias than then switching over to comparable sources that account for the loss of the source, or in case of changes of the environment, something that captures the new dynamic. And that brings us to when crisis hit. And I say here specifically when crisis hit in the context of coverage of conflict, because there actually are a lot of contexts where conflict happened, but the sourcing has been consistent and developments on the ground have been relatively consistent over time. Ukraine, before the Russian invasion of February this year, experienced relatively consistent reporting on what's going on and relatively consistent dynamics in the environment. Afghanistan, before the Taliban takeover of the country last summer, had long periods of consistent conflict dynamics that, of course, change, and reporting changes gradually, but nothing that was like a crisis change. And similarly, lastly, also happened last year, Myanmar, before the military coup of last year, also had ongoing ethnic conflicts in the country, and these were covered consistently. And of course, all these three cases where conflict was already present, a crisis hit that actually changed not only the local environment, but also the reporting environment. And that's where ACLED had to shift its approach and adjust to the new situation. In Myanmar, what happened was that local media sources were cracked down on, and they had to shutter their websites, and they moved to social media for their reporting. Some through the organization and others through journalists reporting individually on social media. So we had to change our sourcing from the original websites and newspapers to moving that to social media and finding those new outlets or new platforms that they used, and the journalists that were reporting on things. In Afghanistan, after the fall of Kabul, we saw that international media had largely left the country, and local reporters went into hiding and became very hesitant to report on Taliban violence against civilians, and also underreported or almost did no reporting on increased activity by new actors competing with the Taliban, like Islamic State. In order to mitigate that, we engaged with two partner organizations, Afghan Peace Watch, who uses networks of local contacts to source new reports for us, and allows us to extend the coverage through to regions that we normally would not be able to cover through the traditional media sources. And we went into a partnership with Extract, which unlocked new data on Islamic State, which had become increasingly active but wasn't being reported by any of the other sources that we covered. And by changing our reporting and our sourcing strategy in Afghanistan, we managed to mitigate these changes on the ground. Now, lastly, in Ukraine, during the invasion in February, we saw some local media shut down or reducing their reporting, limited their activity because of occupying Russian forces, making it impossible for them to conduct their work, while other sources actually refocused their efforts and started reporting on conflict events to much greater extent. And we therefore had to switch our sourcing of particular sources that basically stopped reporting relevant information and switch over to new sources that actually focused and doubled down on the conflict reporting in order to be able to capture this information correctly. In addition to that, as everybody knows, a vast amount of information also became available on social media. in the form of videos and images, distributed by individuals as well as by organized actors. And we have also leveraged that, although we kept to our principled approach that we are careful with sourcing from social media, because it might introduce biases in terms of what is being covered, places where a lot of people are available to capture information with their smartphone, for example, would be overcovered, or regions with better internet connection would see more posts and uploads, as well as the problem, of course, of disinformation and misinformation being circulated. So we really kept to our approach of verifying individual accounts, knowing who they are, why they are reliable, and dealing with the information appropriately. And that brings me to the last point, which are dealing with conflict claims, because sources in conflict environments we find are almost inherently biased, either unintentionally because they have limited access to information, or the way they can operate really limits on what kind of things they can report on, or because they have certain connections to conflict actors. Now, the way we deal with this is, first of all, as we do across our data set, but we double down on these efforts in conflict regions, is to cross-reference claims. We try to find multiple sources for the same claim from multiple perspectives in order to weed out misinformation, to make sure that events happen the way they are described. But this is not always possible. And then, for example, in Afghanistan, we had cases where conflict actors like the Taliban, through their propaganda source, Voice of Jihad, was one of the few sources reporting on attacks in certain regions of the country. Of course, what we could have done is we could have ignored that source entirely because it's biased, it's a conflict actor, or we could have included it all and then reproducing the biases that are within that source. But we rather took a middle of the road approach, and we did careful review and cross comparison of the claims that they made wherever we could. We made an assessment based on that, on what their actual biases are. And we found that while the claims of the Taliban about how many people they killed in attacks was wildly inaccurate and unreliable, the description of the event, location, and date, so a bombing took place at this location at this day, that data was actually accurate and reliable. And so we adjusted for that, and said we can source this source by mentioning the claims on attacks happening on a certain day and a certain location, but we cannot include fatality information because that fatality information is very clearly biased and unreliable. And that is how we adjusted for the known biases, and still were able to leverage and cover parts of the country that otherwise we would have not been able to cover. And lastly, our approach is to code conservatively. If we cannot verify an event, we have concerns about the validity of the claims, for example, on whether the event took place in the first place, we don't code it. If we are unsure whether an actor that was claimed to be present was actually present, we would code it as an unidentified actor instead of claiming that the actor was present. And if there are fatality counts that are conflicting, we default to the most conservative, which is the lowest reliable estimate available. That way, we are still able to source and code events in difficult conflict environments while maintaining the quality integrity of our data. So, the main takeaways. Sourcing strategy is crucial for reliable data. You need to tailor it to local context and reporting environment. And lastly, most important, you also need to adjust your approach and your sourcing based on what's happening on the ground and as crises arise. I hope this was enlightening for you.